9th, 1944, 16:20 hours. Hedgerow Field, 3 miles south of Bayeux, Normandy. Corporal James Mitchell and his section had been advancing cautiously through Norman bocage for 6 hours, clearing fields one hedgerow at a time. The morning had brought 2 German snipers and 1 machine gun nest. Mitchell's men were exhausted, nervy, and absolutely certain that every bush concealed something trying to kill them. The buzzing started low, a mechanical whine that didn't match any engine sound Mitchell recognized. Not a motorcycle, not a jeep. Something smaller, higher-pitched, insistent. The sound was moving, getting closer, coming from the next hedgerow over. Down! Mitchell dropped behind cover, his section following instantly. In Normandy, unidentified mechanical noises meant enemy armor, and enemy armor meant death for infantry caught in the open. The men waited, weapons ready, hearts pounding, expecting a panzer to crash through the hedgerow at any moment. The bushes shook, branches moved, the buzzing intensified, and then, through the undergrowth, rolled the most peculiar vehicle Mitchell had ever seen. It was perhaps 4 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide, tracked like a tank, but scaled down to the size of a large suitcase. It moved with jerky determination, dragging behind it a thick cable that snaked back through the bushes. The thing was painted in German camouflage colors and had a distinctly military appearance, but its dimensions were so absurdly small that Mitchell's brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Private Davies recovered first. "Sir, is that a bloody toy?" The section stared at the miniature tracked vehicle as it continued its advance, oblivious to the British soldiers watching it. The buzzing came from an electric motor that sounded like an angry wasp trapped in a tin can. The tracks churned through grass inefficiently, the entire machine wobbling like a drunk attempting sobriety. Mitchell stood up slowly, rifle lowered. If this is German's secret weapon, they're in worse shape than we thought. Another private, Wilson, who'd worked at a toy factory before conscription, approached the vehicle with professional curiosity. "It's got proper tracks, proper motor, but it's tiny. What's it meant to do? Annoy us to death?" The Goliath, for that was what German engineers called their tracked mine, continued advancing at approximately walking speed, completely unaware that it had become an object of British fascination rather than fear. Wilson followed it for several yards, then simply reached down and yanked the trailing cable. The motor stopped immediately. The great German demolition device sat motionless in the grass, defeated by a private who'd unplugged it. Mitchell walked over and examined the cable. "That's it? The whole thing runs on a lead? What happens if it gets cut?" Wilson shrugged. "Then it stops, sir, like this one just did." The section gathered around their captured prize, initially treating it with the caution appropriate for something that might explode. But as they examined the construction, the crude welding, the exposed motor, the mechanical simplicity, caution gave way to something between amusement and bafflement. "Right," Mitchell said finally. "Someone find out what's inside this thing before we all blow up. The rest of you, spread out and find wherever this cable leads. There's a German somewhere operating this contraption, and I'd very much like to have a conversation with him about his choice of weapons." The cable led back 200 yards to a foxhole containing one very nervous German soldier and a control box that looked like it belonged in a radio shop rather than a battlefield. The Germans surrendered immediately, seeming almost relieved to be captured rather than expected to continue operating the Goliath effectively. Through halting English and gestures, the German explained the weapon's purpose. It carried 100 kilograms of explosives and was meant to destroy tanks, bunkers, or fortifications. You drove it remotely, using the control box until it reached the target, then detonated the charge. Mitchell looked at the tiny vehicle, then at the German soldier, then back at the vehicle. You expected this to destroy a Churchill tank? The German shrugged with the universal expression of soldiers who've been given equipment they don't believe in and ordered to make it work anyway. Orders, he said simply. Mitchell's section would spend the rest of the day telling other units about their encounter with German miniature armor. Within a week, the Goliath had acquired a reputation among British forces not as a fearsome weapon, but as evidence that German military innovation had taken a decidedly peculiar turn. The propaganda promise. The Goliath tracked mine had originated from captured French designs after the 1940 defeat of France. German engineers had examined French remote-controlled demolition vehicles, recognized their potential, and begun development of what they believed would be a revolutionary weapons system. The concept was genuinely innovative, a small, remotely controlled, tracked vehicle carrying substantial explosive charge directly to enemy positions. Unlike artillery or mortars, which might miss or be intercepted, the Goliath would deliver explosives precisely where needed. Tank blocking a bridge, send a Goliath underneath it. Bunker holding up your advance, drive a Goliath through its firing slit. Enemy infantry concentrating in a building, Goliath through the door, then detonation. German propaganda films showed Goliaths operating with mechanical precision, rolling smoothly across open ground, navigating obstacles effortlessly, destroying targets with satisfying explosions. The narration described them as Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, that would revolutionize combat by putting explosive power under remote control. Production goals were ambitious. Tens of thousands of units that would operate alongside conventional forces, providing infantry and armor with precision demolition capability. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda emphasized the psychological dimension. Enemy soldiers facing invisible remote-controlled bombs would lose morale, never knowing when a Goliath might suddenly appear. The weapon combined German engineering excellence with tactical innovation, demonstrating technological superiority that would overcome Allied numerical advantages. British intelligence received reports about Goliaths beginning in 1942. Initial assessments treated them seriously. Remote-controlled explosives were genuinely dangerous if deployed effectively. Training materials warned British troops to watch for small tracked vehicles and to retreat immediately upon seeing them, as they might detonate at any moment. The anticipated threat was significant enough that demolition experts were briefed on Goliath capabilities and tasked with developing countermeasures. Then British forces actually encountered Goliaths in combat, and the assessment changed dramatically. The reality of operation. The Goliath's fundamental problem was its control system. The vehicle was operated via an electrical cable that connected the operator's control box to the vehicle's motor and steering system. This cable had to unreel behind the Goliath as it advanced, maintaining connection over distances up to 800 meters theoretically. In practice, the cable created catastrophic limitations. It snagged on rocks, caught on vegetation, tangled on debris, and generally behaved like every electrical cord humanity has cursed throughout history. Except this one had to function under combat conditions while being dragged across hostile terrain by a device with all the grace of a shopping trolley with broken wheels. Lieutenant Robert Shaw of the Royal Engineers examined multiple captured Goliaths during the Normandy campaign and documented their failures with engineers' precision. His report noted that the cable appeared to be the single most vulnerable component of the entire system. Any damage to the cable, from shrapnel, bullets, being driven over by vehicles, or simply catching on sharp objects would instantly disable the Goliath. The cable's thickness made it visible from considerable distance, meaning enemy soldiers could identify and target it easily. Shaw's testing revealed additional problems. The Goliath's ground pressure and track design made it ineffective on soft ground. It would bog down in mud, struggle through sand, and fail to climb over obstacles higher than a few inches. The motor's power was sufficient for flat, firm ground, but inadequate for most combat terrain. Speed was limited to approximately 6 miles per hour on good surfaces, slower on rough ground, meaning enemy soldiers had ample time to react. The noise was devastating from a tactical perspective. The electric motor produced a distinctive high-pitched whine, audible from hundreds of yards. Any hope of surprise vanished the moment the operator turned on the motor. British soldiers learned to recognize the sound immediately, giving them warning that a Goliath was approaching, and plenty of time to either retreat or target the cable. Durability was poor. The vehicle's construction used thin metal plating that rifle rounds could penetrate easily. A single well-aimed shot could disable the motor, sever control connections, or even detonate the explosive charge prematurely if the round struck at certain angles. British troops discovered they didn't need special weapons or tactics. Ordinary rifles worked perfectly for defeating Goliaths. The operational procedure required 3 German soldiers, 1 to spot the target, 1 to operate the controls, and 1 to manage the cable and ensure it didn't tangle during deployment. This 3-man team was vulnerable to all the normal hazards of combat while attempting to control a device that often refused to cooperate. Under fire, maintaining the concentration required to steer the Goliath precisely became nearly impossible. The comedy of capture. British forces captured Goliaths in extraordinary numbers, often finding them abandoned in perfect working condition. The vehicles were expensive, approximately 4,600 Reichsmarks per unit, equivalent to half a year's wages for German workers. But German soldiers routinely abandoned them, rather than attempting to operate them under combat conditions. The captured Goliaths became objects of fascination and amusement across British units. Soldiers posed for photographs sitting on them, standing beside them with exaggerated poses suggesting they'd captured fearsome German armor. The disparity between the Goliath's sinister appearance, complete with tracks and military paint scheme, and its comically small size created endless opportunities for mockery. Private Thomas Webb of the Durham Light Infantry participated in the capture of 7 Goliaths during the Normandy campaign. His unit began collecting them deliberately, not for intelligence purposes, but for entertainment. They conducted informal testing, racing Goliaths downhill to see whose would go fastest, attempting to drive them through obstacle courses, timing how long it took for cables to tangle under various conditions. The experiments had scientific veneer, but were primarily excuses to play with captured German equipment. One experiment involved testing the Goliath's climbing ability by building progressively larger obstacles. The vehicle failed to surmount a curb. It couldn't climb over a log. It struggled with gravel. The conclusion, as Webb recorded in his diary, was that the Goliath is effective against completely flat ground that happens to be paved, which describes roughly none of the battlefields we've encountered in Europe. Another unit attempted to use a captured Goliath operationally, steering it toward a German position to return it to sender, as it were. The cable tangled within 50 yards. The motor overheated. The tracks threw themselves off the drive wheels. The attempt was abandoned when someone pointed out that simply throwing the explosive charge would be more effective than trying to drive it anywhere using German controls. The technical examinations revealed construction that British engineers found simultaneously impressive and baffling. The motor was well engineered, the tracks were properly designed, and the control system worked when everything functioned correctly. But the overall design seemed to ignore basic operational realities. It was like examining a precision watch that only told time on Tuesdays. The craftsmanship was evident, but the utility was questionable. Sergeant Alan Price, a pre-war automotive mechanic, spent an afternoon dismantling a captured Goliath to understand its construction. His conclusion? It's brilliantly made for doing exactly the wrong thing. Every component is quality, German engineering applied to creating a device that can't function in combat. Someone designed this in a laboratory and never tested it in a muddy field while people were shooting at them. It shows. The successful exceptions. To be fair to German engineers, Goliaths did occasionally work as intended. British after-action reports documented perhaps 24 instances where Goliaths successfully destroyed targets or inflicted casualties. These successes occurred under specific circumstances that maximized the weapon's advantages while minimizing its considerable disadvantages. The most effective use was against static fortifications in urban environments. During fighting in Kar, German forces used Goliaths to destroy several British defensive positions established in buildings. The vehicles operated on paved streets, had clear routes to targets, and detonated before British defenders could react effectively. The explosive charge was substantial enough that successful detonation meant complete destruction of the target. One British strongpoint, a reinforced house covering a crucial intersection, was destroyed when a Goliath drove through the ground floor and detonated, collapsing the building and killing 8 soldiers. The attack succeeded because the operator had clear sight lines. The Goliath traveled on pavement rather than rough ground, and British defenders were focused on other threats until too late. Another successful employment occurred at a bridge where British engineers were attempting to clear German demolition charges. A Goliath approached along the bridge deck, traveling on flat concrete, and detonated among the engineering team, killing 4 men and wounding several others. The success came from optimal terrain and surprise. The engineers weren't expecting remote-controlled explosives and didn't recognize the threat until impact was imminent. These successes, however, were vastly outnumbered by failures. For every Goliath that destroyed its target, dozens were captured, disabled, or abandoned. The weapon's theoretical capability existed, but operational reality made that capability almost impossible to realize under normal combat conditions. German soldiers operating Goliaths faced impossible pressure. They were expected to control a temperamental device under fire while maintaining line of sight to both the vehicle and the target. Any interruption, incoming artillery, small arms fire, smoke, confusion, would likely result in losing control or having the cable severed. Success required perfect conditions that modern warfare rarely provided. British veterans who witnessed successful Goliath attacks generally acknowledged they were effective when they worked, followed immediately by noting how rarely they worked. The weapon's fundamental concept was sound, but execution was compromised by technology limitations and operational impracticality. The soldier's perspective. For British soldiers who encountered Goliaths repeatedly, the weapon became something between a nuisance and a joke. The initial reaction, fear of unknown remote-controlled explosives, quickly gave way to recognition that Goliaths posed minimal threat to alert infantry. Corporal James Mitchell, who'd encountered the first Goliath his section had seen, encountered 7 more during the Normandy campaign. His response evolved from cautious investigation to immediate tactical solution. Spot the Goliath, identify its cable, shoot the cable, capture or destroy the disabled vehicle. The entire process took perhaps 30 seconds once you knew what to look for. Mitchell's section developed informal protocols for Goliath encounters that were eventually adopted more widely. Upon hearing the distinctive motor whine, soldiers would scan for the cable, which was usually visible and always essential. A single rifleman would target the cable while others covered possible German operator positions. Once the cable was severed, soldiers could approach the disabled Goliath safely. Without control input, it was just an inert tracked box containing explosives that wouldn't detonate without the operator triggering them remotely. The protocol's effectiveness demonstrated the Goliath's fundamental vulnerability. The weapon's operation depended entirely on maintaining cable connection, which was easily disrupted by determined opposition. German operators needed perfect conditions: flat ground, clear sight lines, no enemy fire, cable remaining intact to successfully employ the weapon. Combat rarely provided perfect conditions. British soldiers developed additional tactics through experience. Throwing smoke grenades near the Goliath would obscure the operator's view, making control impossible. Artillery fire or mortar rounds near the cable route would almost certainly sever connection. Even sustained machine gun fire across the likely cable path would eventually hit and disable the thin wire. The psychological impact was opposite to what German propaganda had promised. Instead of demoralizing British troops, Goliaths became sources of dark humor and easy captures. Soldiers who destroyed or captured Goliaths received good-natured teasing about their victories over fearsome German miniature armor. The weapons went from unknown threat to running joke in the span of weeks. The final assessment. British forces encountered Goliaths with initial caution that quickly transformed into amused familiarity. The weapons were collected, studied, tested, and ultimately dismissed as evidence of German desperation rather than German innovation. They provided entertainment, intelligence, and cautionary lessons about weapon design, but they didn't provide significant military threat. Corporal James Mitchell, who'd encountered his first Goliath in June 1944 and his last in March 1945, reflected on the weapon in later years. The Goliath was beautifully made for doing something impractical. Every component was quality engineering, but the whole contraption couldn't function in real combat. Someone had designed an elegant solution to a problem they didn't properly understand. We learned to treat them like unexploded ordnance that occasionally moved, cautious respect for what they could do, but no real fear because they rarely actually worked. They were the war's oddest footnote, these expensive German toys that buzzed around battlefields looking dangerous but mostly just getting captured. The British perspective on Goliaths remained consistent from first encounter to final assessment. Innovative concept, poor execution, minimal threat, considerable amusement. Germany had devoted substantial resources to producing thousands of remote-controlled tracked mines, and British forces had responded by shooting their cables and collecting them as souvenirs. The Goliath promised revolution in combat demolition. It delivered instead a demonstration that technological innovation without operational practicality produces expensive complications rather than effective weapons. And it gave British soldiers something to laugh about during a campaign that otherwise offered precious little humor, which may have been the Goliath's greatest contribution to the war effort, though not the one German engineers had intended. The tiny tracked mines buzzed across battlefields, dragging their vulnerable cables behind them, occasionally destroying targets, but mostly providing entertainment for British troops who'd learned to recognize their distinctive whine and immediately look for the cable they could shoot to end the threat. Germany called them Goliaths, suggesting unstoppable power. The British called them Jerry's toy tanks, which suggested exactly what soldiers thought of Germany's remote-controlled wonder weapon. In the end, both names were accurate in their way. The Goliath was named after a giant and performed like a toy, impressive in photographs, disappointing in practice, and remembered primarily for how easily it was defeated by soldiers who'd learned that German innovation sometimes produced complications that looked dangerous but rarely were.